So I would like to just do a short welcome and an introduction for Peter, and then I'm going to turn this over to Peter. So on behalf of the Global Society for Organizational Learning and the Global Coaching Community of Practice, I welcome each of you in all the 13 plus countries to this Zoom call, and to those of you joining us by way of YouTube live streaming. My name is Stephen Giannotti. I'm chair of the Global SoL Systems Thinking Professional Association, created by our guest speaker over 2.5 decades ago. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. To minimize background distractions, please keep yourselves on mute during our presentation. Feel free to raise your hand or place questions or comments in the chat. We'll do our very best to weave in some of them during the dialogue today. We'll be recording this event for colleagues that have been unable to attend. In terms of today's agenda, our guest speaker will do an initial settling in exercise with us and then speak to the 5 questions that we shared with you in the invitation. I will also put those in the chat. Next, we will do one breakout session for about 10 minutes and then come back for some additional dialogue. And then Peter will conduct a brief closing exercise. While our guest speaker today most likely doesn't need an introduction, and Peter asked me to keep it brief, but when you introduce Peter, it's really challenging to keep it brief because there's so much to say. I would like to remind those of us who have been learning from him for decades, and for those of us who might be relatively new to his wisdom, just a few of his many, many accomplishments that have helped our world from sliding into the proverbial abyss and in many places advancing forward dramatically. Originally an aerospace engineer out of Stanford University, Peter attained his MS in social systems modeling, and then earned his PhD in management from MIT's Sloan School of Management, where he is senior lecturer on leadership and sustainability. He's the co-founder of both Center for Systems Awareness and Academy for Systems Change. He's a prolific author of 7 pioneering books on learning organizations, systems thinking, education, and transformational change, one of which, The Fifth Discipline, Harvard Business Review identified as the seminal management book of the previous 75 years. It's my distinct honor to introduce to you our fellow systems thinker, Global SoL Inspirational Council member, and for many of us, a mentor and a colleague and a lifelong Sherpa for systemic and sustainable change, Peter Senge.
Good morning, everybody. Good evening, good day. I guess good day kind of comes back now as the ubiquitous greeting. I'm sure all of us are quite familiar now with this kind of new reality, this Zoom land we all live in, which of course is in some ways a poor substitute for being together physically, but in other ways it's kind of opening a lot of doors. I'm sure this is an experience that many of you have had in different ways. The opportunity to really connect with people all around the world. I mean, I think I've stopped counting, but I'm sure there's been at least 40 or 50 conversations I've been in, some part of longer workshops, some part of, we do a weekly session as part of our Center for Systems Awareness. And you start to get used to this really fascinating reality, to look on your screen and see people from all over, literally from all over. It's a wonderful thing. I also love the intrusion of everyday reality. I think there was one of the TV shows, probably one of the talk shows, late night, like Saturday Night Live. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was several months ago, and a very well-known host was there, and of course he's at home, and all of a sudden his dog wanders in. It was like a priceless moment. All of a sudden the professional and the personal just kind of vanished, all one life. And of course that's always been true. We just live one life. And we show up in different places in different ways, but the kind of facade that there's the professional me, the personal me, the mother me, the professional engineer me, et cetera, is just that. It's a kind of a facade. So that's kind of one of my kind of most memorable moments of the last 6 months, having Jimmy Kimmel's dog show up in the middle of his welcoming people to Saturday Night Live. So it is a strange reality, but in some ways very fitting. And the basic plan, as Stephen said, is I'm going to speak for a few minutes, just kind of reflecting on my kind of little worm's eye view of what's going on in the world. I'm sure it'll connect with hopefully a lot of yours. And then we'll go into breakout rooms, let everybody do a little bit of a check-in, do a little bit of a grounding practice beforehand, and then we'll do a check-in. And then we'll come back and just have open conversation. As I kind of looked at how many familiar faces, and I kind of have held off saying hi to individuals because I don't want to miss some, but it's wonderful to see so many people that I've known personally for a long time. The obvious thing to do is, well, let's just have a conversation. I also am very well aware in a setting like this, there's a lot of people who are kind of new and don't have the same background. You've got this extraordinary spectrum of people with 30 years of background to people with, now 10 minutes of background. So always try to do this in a way that the people who are new feel like they have a little idea what they've stepped into and what some of the kind of basic notions that the rest of us share. So I'll speak for a few minutes, a little bit on the background and how, the journey of building up this wonderful kind of global network of relationships. And then a few reflections on the kind of questions we put into the invitation. Not much, but just a little. Those were meant mainly to get us all thinking about what would be a meaningful conversation. Then we'll do the breakout rooms, then we'll come back. So a good chunk of this will just be open conversation. And I felt even more drawn to that when I saw how many familiar faces are here. But for those of you particularly who are relatively new, let me just give a few kind of just obviously personal kind of reflections on the journey. So this work in many ways started off with in some ways, a much narrower focus than what eventually developed, but in other ways, it's always been the same focus. In the first 10 years or so, most of the work was with corporations, particularly large global corporations at that time. And we had a small group that formed a center at MIT called the Center for Organisational Learning. Originally called a program, then it became a center. It was a systems thinking and organizational learning program. Then it became a Center for Organizational Learning. But the key in that phase, or the key way to characterize it, was a small group of about a dozen or so corporations, most of which were US based, most of which were large, like Fortune 50, Fortune 100 corporations. And the reason was not that we were, at that time, those of us doing this organizing, exclusively interested in business. That was never the case. It was just easier. There was openness. There was a growing awareness that the world was changing, that you might say the strategic imperatives of business were really shifting. And it was the early days where everybody was waking up to globalization, and that your competitors weren't necessarily the competitors you knew. The industry you had thought was your industry was changing. Everything was changing. And of course, that's created a tremendous openness. And that openness, is often the case, and we see it being replayed today, is always in a minority. I think this is a kind of a first principle of deep change, never led by the mainstream. Obviously, almost by definition, the mainstream is protecting what is, or conserving, or trying to preserve a status quo. So we had the radicals from the business community. They were typically small numbers of individuals from big corporations, but we were pretty selective in that we tried to focus on ones who were relatively well placed, so that there wasn't just their personal interest, but they could generate some collective interest in their organization. The ideas of organizational learning were kind of in formation during this time, and gradually it coalesced into a pretty simple, but I think what's proven to be a pretty enduring perspective, that this work was always around how do people clarify what really matters to them, what's their vision, what they want to create. The more turbulent the outside world is, the more clarity is important on our own kind of core aspirations, what really does matter to us. As the old metaphor goes, the stronger the winds, the stronger the rudder. If your rudder is weak, it doesn't really matter about the rest of your boat. It'll go wherever the winds take it. So there was always that core of aspiration and meaningfulness. and purpose and vision, all kind of wrapped up in this one domain of, so when all is said and done, what is it we most want to see emerge in this unpredictable and turbulent time? And the second cornerstone was the systems perspective. That was kind of my training in many ways, getting established at MIT. We were trying to kind of continue a lineage of leadership that I had been beneficiary of even starting as a graduate student, of understanding complexity and interdependence, this whole systems thinking. And today we often call it systems awareness, because it's clearly not just an intellectual thing. We don't understand a family only as a system. We live in families. We understand the dynamics, or we experience the dynamics for good and ill. So today we often call it systems thinking and systems sensing, a term we started using from Otto Scharmer. So the second cornerstone was always around a more systemic awareness. And then the third had to do with, this all comes together by creating a space that's safe for reflection. One of the important influences, maybe about 5 years after we really got started, but I was reading his work in the 80s, was Humberto Maturana from Chile, the famous biologist from Chile. And Humberto used to say, it is only through reflection that we change our history. It is only through reflection that we change our history. We do what we do because that's what we've done. Habit is without doubt the most powerful force in human affairs in some ways, personally and collectively. Institutions work the way they work because that's the way they've worked. And anyone who's new to any business or any organization that says, hey, why do you do things like this, finds out the most common answer is because this is the way we've always done it. So this is not good or bad any more than it's bad at the personal level. Habit formation is very efficient. It's another way to talk about learning. As we learn, we form habits. That's not the problem. The problem is the habits become unconscious. They become automatic. They become simply ways we do things, simply ways we think. These deep ingrained routines of thought, action, and emotion fade into the background. So while at one stage in our life and one stage in our institution's life, they might have been more conscious choices, efforts of purposeful learning, they eventually become habit. Again, this is not good or bad, but it's simply a way to kind of point to why this notion of reflection emerged as being so important. Because until we create the safety to ask ourselves, well, why do we do it this way? Why do we believe what we believe? Why do our institutions or our societies follow the paths they follow? We have to recognize that the primary reason is because we have followed them. You know, why is GDP such a big deal in the world? I mean, very few people, I don't know the numbers, I haven't asked you, but if we have 100 people on this call, I could bet there's not more than 5 who can define how GDP is actually measured. It's a very arcane set of value-added calculations, and no one's ever seen one, really. I mean, have you ever seen a GDP? And yet our societies worship it and define our progress. If you think about it, we define our progress by something that no one has ever seen and can't even define what it means technically. And just using this as an example, it's a simple example of this principle that we do what we do because that's what we do, because that's what we've done. We measure what we measure because we're used to measuring it. And after a while, it becomes sort of like a religion, unquestionable. So I'm just using that to illustrate why this notion of reflection became kind of an integrating concept, because we reflect on our purpose and our intent, and that has to do with the soul domain of aspiration. And we reflect on our reality. And the more we reflect on our reality, the more we realize that it's profoundly interconnected. So that's the whole systems awareness piece. But the personal practice of reflection is really, in some sense, the glue. And without that, the others can drift into being more intellectual, abstract than real and human and concrete. Reflection only occurs in the moment. It doesn't occur in the past, doesn't occur in the future. Thinking about my thinking, pausing, going, How do I feel right now? What am I thinking about right now? These are acts, fundamental human actions that bring us into the present. They only occur in the present. So this kind of integration of ideas, and I'm describing them really now, of course, as ideas, but sitting behind each of them were bodies of tools and methods and theories, gradually came together, formed the basis of what eventually became the 5 disciplines. Sometimes we use this 3-legged stool to point to the 3 different domains. And that was really pretty clear by the early 90s, and the 5th discipline book kind of synthesized all that. But from that point on, it was really all about so what and how do you do it. So again, continuing in the 90s, we were mainly focused on individual organizations, particularly businesses, but it was becoming more and more clear by the end of the 90s that the real systemic changes could only be brought about by collaboration across many boundaries, internally, but particularly externally. Businesses working together across supply chains. Businesses, governments, and civil society working together on the big systemic issues that are common to all. And so that became the journey of the next decade or two. And gradually there was focus areas, and I'll complete my kind of reflection by just summarizing some of, to me at least, the key focus areas today. The systems that we all live in that shape our reality and that really need to be priorities. Food would be the first. There is no substitute for food. There is no substitute for water. And globally speaking, our global, which has become, of course, increasingly global food system, is a disaster. There's probably no greater cause of poverty in the world than the creation of commodity markets and all the pressures that come from commodity markets that drive smallholders, traditional agricultural leaders off their land, or force them into marketplaces that are governed by large food corporations. The ecological disaster that is the food system is again one of the primary sources of ecological imbalance in the world. We have lost a third of the topsoil in the world in the last 50 years. Topsoil takes 100 to 200 years to regenerate. As any farmer in any culture will tell you, your health of your food is your soil. It's the nutrients. It's the foundation of the creation of what we ultimately eat. And it doesn't matter whether it's meat protein or vegetable protein. And then analogously, the exact same thing is true in the oceans, where the health of the oceans, the basic nutrient balances, the plankton, the biomass of the oceans is the foundation for all the marine or aquatic food systems. So first is food and water. Then, of course, there's energy. Human beings have always had to pay attention to energy. It's only been in the last 100 years or so that energy became free. What I mean by free is that nobody has to think much about it. When we plug our gadget into the wall, wherever we are, we get energy that for all intents and purposes we don't pay for, or we don't pay much for. Very few businesses think about the energy cost of a new decision. But what we've become more and more apparent to us is that the real costs of energy system are not the direct costs, they're the indirect costs. They're the destabilization of climate, they're the acidification and warming of the oceans. They are one of the most powerful set of forces that are really creating the ecological and social imbalances around the world. And so then there's lastly, you might say, the social domain, the extraordinary inequity that we've all become quite accustomed to. I remember years ago when Oxfam started keeping track of the number of people who had the equal amount of private wealth to the poorest half of the world. So that was a statistic they started to publish about 2003 or 4. How many people have as much money as the poorest half of humanity? And I'll never forget, years ago, it was like a shock to us when that became about 100. 100 people having as much money as the poorest half of humanity. Today, the number, when I last looked, was about 8. It's a bizarre number. I mean, an incomprehensible number. And of course, during the pandemic, it's become even more concentrated because so many people who depend on face-to-face interactions for their employment have had great stress, and others who live online and make their money online, this is a great deal. So in any event, so these are examples of the systems or the systemic imbalances we need to attend to. The social and ecological are the same. I think this has always been a big problem of misunderstanding. We tend to try to treat ecological issues like they sit over here, isolated. But of course, the whole nature of ecology is interconnected. There is no resource stress. It is not a social problem. Poor people always suffer most when there's resource scarcity. The number one cause of wars in human history has been competition for scarce resources. So the social imbalances and the ecological imbalances are not separate. So gradually, as we started to kind of understand these things, we realized that the work really was not about individual organizations, about collaborating networks of organizations, and the collaboration needed to occur across every boundary imaginable. Political, institutional, geographic, and cultural. So now we sit here in a present reality where the imperative is fairly clear. I mean, I'll use climate change as an example, and it's just an example. The problems of the world are not really climate change per se. Climate change is a symptom of these sort of imbalances. And we all kind of are increasingly aware of the interconnectedness. You know, the fact that Mother Nature has said, no, go back to your rooms now. 6 months ago, when pandemic started to spread around the world, you need to go back to your rooms and close the door, all of you, right? Because you don't know how to live together in the world. Oh, by the way, the events were strange. You know, something happened presumably in a marketplace in some part of China that eventually made everybody in the world go back to their rooms. It's a simple metaphor for interconnectedness. But if you really look deeper, the COVID pandemic is just one of a series of similar global health crises we've gone through over the last 2 decades, whether it's SARS or the various Ebola, or even before that, we had, of course, the epidemics that started in Africa and spread in the form of other, acute public health crises. The main thing that's different now is it affects absolutely everybody, whereas some were more limited for different reasons to different populations, but they had their same root. Fritjof Capra and I were in a session like this not too long ago, the famous physicist, and he had a very simple kind of take on the present epidemic. He said, well, it's basically Gaia, Mother Earth, telling us that, we can't keep crossing this threshold. The encroachment of human civilization on the rest of life has kind of grown and grown and grown. The buffer zones between where humans live and where the, quote, wild or non-domesticated animal populations are have collapsed. So there's more and more contact. And if you look at all of these various global pandemics, they had the same, it's called zoonosis in biology, where a virus jumps from an animal population, a wild animal population, where it's basically benign, generally, into the human population where it's not benign. So that's kind of the deeper dynamic that's characterized all these. And it's a beautiful kind of illustration of this profound interconnectedness. And it's the world we all live in. So we stop there. And we're going to do a couple things that I would like to kind of do a little more slowly. The only purpose of these comments up to now has been to kind of create a context for the conversation that we can all start to engage in. But before we jump right into the conversation, I'd like to give us a few minutes of just some quiet time. I've jumped around amongst a lot of different things. In part purposefully to kind of create this kind of multifaceted picture of the backdrop and the kind of evolution of the work. But hopefully in this, I've touched on at least one or two things that are really central to your own work. And if you ask yourself, what am I up to? What am I doing right now? What are my priorities? What are some of the projects that have the most meaning to me right now? Then that's probably a good place to start. So let's take a couple minutes. My journal is tucked away in my bag here, of course. It's always nice to have a journal handy. And we're going to just do a simple grounding practice to kind of slow us down. This is a little bit kind of captured in part by my rudder metaphor. We're all kind of caught in a turbulence right now. And of course, we experience it emotionally, not just cognitively. And so, in some sense, the first priority or the first imperative for each of us is how do we get quiet in the middle of the storm? How do we, as Emerson said years ago, keep our head about us when all else are losing theirs? You know, how do we develop practices of simply slowing down, pausing, and then reflecting? So I'm going to just lead us through a simple grounding practice. And then after we finish this, I'll give you a little time to do some journaling. And after that, we'll go into breakout rooms for a check-in. Okay, and I'll explain that process in detail for those who are new as we go into it. But just take a moment and take a nice deep breath and just relax. In our Global Education Network, we've been having weekly calls with a group about this size. It's been quite beautiful. People from all around the world who are deeply engaged in bringing this systems perspective of what today we call compassionate systems perspective into education. And yesterday, our session was really around how do we integrate somatic awareness into our normal routines and our reflective processes. For those of you who don't know the term, somatic is the same as embodied. We live in a place. You might say there's three bodies we're always part of. There's the earth body, there's this physical place. There's the social body, there's the awareness of the interconnected social reality, friends and family. But then, of course, all that is in a physical body. So I'm just now talking at the material level right now, the physical level. There's always these three bodies. But in some ways, our access to all three is through the same portal. It's the one that's never far from us. Sometimes it seems a ways from us, but that's simply because we maybe haven't anchored the practice of noticing what it feels like to sit on our chair. Just take a moment. If you want to close your eyes, you can. For many of us, that helps. But you can also do it with your eyes open. Just relax your gaze and just allow it to take in without focusing on anything particular. Just notice what it's like to sit in this chair. If you're sitting on the floor or you're on something else, just notice the points of contact of your body with the floor, the chair, the couch, whatever. And just take another moment or two to be kind of open to what's going on in this immediate embodied awareness we call a body. Any areas of tightness or tension. Take a nice, slow, deep breath. And as you breathe, just notice the effects of a breath, how it expands parts of your body. Sometimes, especially when we're under stress, our breathing gets very shallow. We hardly engage our chest, our diaphragm, our upper body at all. But if we take a really slow breath, you can literally start to feel the muscles of the upper body, the chest, the diaphragm expanding. So just continue to take some very slow, deep breaths and really notice the experience physically of just allowing yourself the pleasure of a breath. As you continue to pay attention to your breathing, you start to see a very fundamental rhythm. It's one of the rhythms that defines our life. The in, the out. As you allow this rhythm to slow, just notice the pauses that occur naturally. There's a natural pause at the end of the in-breath. Just notice that pause as the out-breath or the exhale starts. There's also a natural pause. In some sense, naturally, it's a bit longer at the end of the exhalation, at the end of the out-breath. As your breathing slows, that pause will get a little longer. And any sense of hurry or rush to get the next in-breath starts to be tempered by simply allowing the full extent of the out-breath. You might start to be aware as you slow the pace of this breathing that you also expand your awareness, your physical awareness. You start to be aware of subtle motions in the body, movements of energy. This is the doorway to all fundamental contemplative practices. East and West, traditional cultures, and contemporary cultures. Anapana in Sanskrit, in, out. So you can allow the rhythm of the breath to also be a simple metaphor for all the rhythms of the living or natural world. There's always breathing in and breathing out. The larger natural space around you is doing the exact same thing. When groups of people sit and start to get quiet together, there's a natural synchrony that occurs in their breathing and their movements. The reason somatic awareness is so useful is it doesn't lie. The body doesn't know how to lie. So it always gives us a direct access to what's really going on. And there's a natural connectedness. Somatically, we are connected. You might even start to feel this amongst this group of people right now. Here we are, sitting wherever we're sitting. We are literally distributed around the world, and yet we're breathing together. In this world of subtle somatic interconnectedness, space does not operate in quite the same way. The same is true of time. So through this very, very simple practice of slowing down, slowing down, slowing down, slowing down, and just noticing the somatic rhythms, the embodied rhythms that are always there, many doorways start to open up. So whenever you're ready, just take out your journal. And I know many of you are familiar with basic journaling practices, but some are not. If you don't have a journal handy, you can take out a piece of paper. I'd recommend, if you can, do this in physical writing, not on a gadget, just because the motion of the hand, the connection of the mind, body, heart system through the movement of simple writing or drawing, you may find yourself drawing pictures. It's one of the reasons calligraphy was one of the fundamental parts of the traditional Chinese education system, because through the mind, heart, body connection, as we translate into some gesture and representation through our hand, there's a whole set of neural pathways that are active. So my only suggestion is do it in writing, whatever form, and just start to pay attention. What's up? What's moving? What's a thought or feeling that's coming to me now? Again, if you find yourself drawing pictures, that's fine. If you find yourself creating images that you're not even sure what they mean, that's fine. Or you might find yourself just writing some words. This is a private space, so please don't feel you need to censor or edit in any way. When I ask you to do the check-in next, I will not ask you to share literally what you wrote down, unless you choose to do so. So just allow yourself this moment of awareness of what's moving in me. And I'll be quiet now for a few minutes while you continue your journaling. Take another minute or so. I'm going to say a word or two about what will happen next. If you're still writing, please continue. So in just a minute, you'll be moved into breakout rooms. There'll be about 4 people, maybe in some cases 5. So it'll be a small group of 4 or 5. And what I'd like you to do first is a simple practice that we've all found over the years to be a very useful way to start any collective conversation. I'd like you to go around a proverbial circle. You can imagine yourself sitting in a circle and let each person talk for 1 to 2 minutes. You can talk about whatever you want. There may be some question that was stirred up in my opening comments. There may be some question you came into this session with. There may be something that arose during your journaling. It doesn't really matter. The main thing is to get around the circle and hear from each person. This is a simple but unusual kind of practice because, you know, when groups talk, it's very often that one person says something, then someone responds, and those 2 people talk, and the others are kind of sitting there going, gee, when do I get to talk? So everyone will get to talk before the group starts just an informal conversation. So that's what I mean by going around the circle. I'd strongly encourage you to put your video on. It matters a lot when you're in the small groups that you can see each other's faces. So please, as you move into the breakout room, please turn your video on. And it doesn't matter who starts. And if you're not sure what to say, that's fine, just to let someone else start. But try to keep in mind about no more than 2 minutes each. I would say a minute to 2 minutes is the right time frame. So you hear each voice, and then you'll get around the circle obviously in 8 to 10 minutes, and then you'll have another 5 minutes or so just to kind of let the conversation continue to unfold. You'll have about 15 minutes in total. We'll come back at the hour. It's 45 minutes after the hour now. Okay? So whenever you're ready, whoever wants to start, and make sure you get to hear from each person before you just start interacting. So basically, this is a practice in listening. We call it a check-in. What it really is a basic listening practice. And just notice the nature of your listening. Listening is not a passive action. It's something where we can really open our hearts and minds to each other. So this all comes down to the quality of that listening, which shapes the social field that arises when a group of people are together. Okay, enjoy. We'll see you in 15 minutes.
Looks like people are trickling back in. Thank you very much. It's a treat to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Welcome back, everybody. I think everyone has come back, and again, the plan for this portion is just to continue the conversation. So maybe there might be some thoughts or themes or feelings that emerged in the small group that you'd like to bring back to the large group. My only suggestion is that it's nice to hear from as many people as possible. So to try to keep your comments, 15, 30 seconds, relatively brief, so that we can hear from multiple people. And it's not really a question and answer. So if you have particular questions that you're wrestling with, I'll do my best to keep track of them and maybe, offer some reflections after we've gone for 10 or 15 minutes. But please, it's just an open space now.
And Peter, is it okay if people put some questions in the chat as well?
Yeah, that's fine, Stephen, but I'm going to leave for you to sift through those, since I'd rather look at people's faces.
That's fine. Good. Thank you.
I would
Christina.
like to share, hi Peter, I would like to share something that was really beautiful that came to me in the meditation. I'm very touched by it. I saw millions and millions of children in my meditation. I mean, they were kind of faceless, but they were children, beautiful children, and hope came back. Hope was not present to me any longer. But amazingly, very strong hope, genuine hope came back when I saw this immense flow of children.
Thank you.
During the last part of the previous part of the session, I was thinking about the metaphor of Gaia and the reaction of Gaia against the humanity. And I was not perfectly agreeing with it, because I was thinking instead of a sort of the anthropomorphization of the images that we have about the reality. Gaia can be under our control, but the idea that I had was instead of a critical mass of uranium that being compacted, starting to produce the famous nuclear reaction. And on those kind of things, being in physics and not anymore in the social field, we have no control over it. So my opinion is that the mental model that we use thinking about Gaia can be wrong. And if we start instead from a point of view of nuclear explosion, maybe we can free up our minds from some bias and maybe confront with it in a different way.
Thank you.
If I may share. What basically emerged in our small group while we were talking was the idea of breathing in unity, and how useful it is to deliberately choose to slow down, like we just did in this exercise of Peter.
Thank you.
Hey, this is Smita Shetty. So as Peter was talking and through that mindfulness exercise, what came to me was the fact that there are things that we believe to be absolutely true, that are absolutely false. And we can't seem to get past it. And if you become the outlier, you actually sometimes tend to face backlash. So to kind of actually be conscious of what is really the right thing and to follow that path is something that I've been thinking about the last couple minutes.
Thank you.
Hello, Peter. Thank you for this beautiful meeting. What emerged from our conversation was deliberately moving from economic orientation to social orientation and expanding on that, and the difficulty and challenges that would exist to move from ego to echo, and and letting go, and what would we be letting go when it's in unpredictable times. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for this time with you. I was reflecting that we really can't begin to make any progress on anything without the somatic piece. And how do we get people to begin that conversation from that space when they may not be open to that? At the same time, I've been spending a lot of time with Jeremy Lent's book, The Patterning Instinct. And just because when you mentioned, we don't know what this thing is, GDP, he has a magnificent exploration of the mental models that have gone into creating GDP. And it's really a beautiful journey. Fritjof Capra wrote the preface to that book, and it's just very rich indeed in the mental model experience of exactly what you're talking about, and feeling quite grateful that our collective work on this and deepening the understanding of all these mental models, I feel is really beginning to blossom in a way that is important for us. Yeah. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for this meeting. I wanted to share my reflection was that the purpose is so important. If our purpose is contributing to all living beings, then that will make a huge difference. And to be able to live our purpose, we need to let go of mental models that are blocking us or hindering us from seeing how to live our purpose.
Thank you.
If I can jump in just with a thought. Because I was in the group with Antti and we're talking about also the acceleration and the speed and the need to slow down. But also I've been lately reading the work of Howe and Strauss in the Fourth Turning, this cycle generations, the idea of clash of mental models and this cycle of mental models, which ends in a crisis and then a awakening. So it is a letting go. I think if you follow that historical, I guess it's a hypothesis, or I don't know, of the fourth turning of these 4 cycles that lead to a crisis and then a rebirth. I see that very much being this this mental model letting go. We're letting go of the old model. It's accelerating. The things are accelerating so fast. Do we need a crisis to be able to blow up our existing mental models? I don't know. It's just a question. But it's also freeing and liberating in a strong sense. And I think the internet and the globalization of things, the internet of things, has allowed us like never before in human history to connect across borders, across seas, across languages, across religions and ethnicities, which is so new. So I just share that. Yeah.
Thank you.
If I can build off of that statement by Robert, I think this is going to what I was reflecting on, which was how deeply we're relating to ourselves, or not deeply relating to ourselves, to nature, to each other. And that goes to, I think, what Peter was telling us as we entered the groups, was about our listening. And you know, that to me is about how do we deeply listen, both internally and to ourselves and to others, and again, even to nature. As I go through my morning trail runs, you know, what is it that I'm sensing about what's happening around me? And I think that is, to me, where we let go of some of the mental models, that just openness and curiosity, and that was what was coming to me through the conversations that we were having too. Thank you.
Thank you.
My reflection, thank you all for being here, because that's part of my reflection, actually, and for Peter to open up this opportunity, is that how important it is to make all voices heard. And especially when we work with changes coming about, how much resistance there is coming from not being listened to. And how deep listening, actually showing the respect to each person you listen to, allow that connection to happen. And how important that is to the world as it is today, to practice that. And to that way also reach out and let that resistance to change, you know, go, but do this together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Annika.
Yeah, this is Raja. I'm speaking from Bangalore, India. For me, at this moment, there are 2 words from Sanskrit that are kind of, I'm taught. It's, in some sense, it's coming to me. One is Maya. In English, probably it can be, surely I think it's difficult, but still it can be called implicate order. But Maya is, nothing is true, and all that is what you see. It is not what it is. That's generally what the whole thing is. So somewhere my teaching says that human beings do not have capacity to, when we operate from cognitive mind, to actually see the implicate order. So today's simple thing what Peter did in terms of the breath, the other word in Sanskrit for breath is prana. Prana is also life, or life energy. So in some sense, if all of us are able to connect to our prana, probably we might be able to see collectively the implicate order. So that's my thought at this moment.
Thank you.
Yeah, what I see is something I'm always longing for. It's actually, I'm very happy to be with you all, and especially with you, Peter, because you've been so important for my thinking and my journey on the planet. It's actually simplicity without reduction. And I think we need more than ever a common language now over the planet, because more than ever, it's obvious that we are interconnected now through the planet. And so the 5 disciplines and the work that was done already in the 70s and the 80s and in the 90s to kind of carve out this language has helped a lot. And I think it's probably now it's more useful than ever. So thank you so much.
Yes. Grateful to everyone. I'm not seeing the full screen. Grateful for Peter also to have started the conversation today, explaining and sharing with us the history in the past 30 odd years and what took place then, which is to me quite an important aspect to be reminded of. One thing is knowing what needs to be done and knowing what is possible. The other thing is actually doing. And actually doing is a continuous exercise. It is always about humility and openness and connection. And having achieved some things doesn't mean you're there. It's about continuing to learn and continue to be humble and continue to connect with yourself and with others as well. So I'm very, very grateful to learn that, to experience that physically, and to be able to share that also with such large group.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for what you said. And in my mind, I think we have not been enough aware of the emergence of the living systems. And referring to Maturana, what you said about the living, this is for me so important. And so we have not been able to anticipate because we had not get enough social perception to understand what was emerging from the living system.
Thank you. Thanks, Sari.
Thank you, Peter, for inviting this meeting. And I think I'm now talking and see everyone is to invite mail and click one click and I can see everyone in the world. And it's important that first door, knock and open. If I don't knock and open the first door, I can see the next door. It's important to knock and open the first door. I understand it's important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I was thinking about the interconnectedness and I really took it as an experience when we did the exercise here. It was like really a feeling of wellness, being connected to so many people. And it sort of came out as maybe interconnectedness is more like a journey of consciousness, because I felt it happen on so many levels and sort of connected to so many systems, if you like. So we're interconnected through the earth and through life and through listening and through the ecology and everything. It became extremely complex, but also very rewarding. So this journey through consciousness is like becoming aware of all possible ways of interconnecting. That was beautiful. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. The experience of breathing together, Peter, that you sort of led us through. I really had that sense. And, you know, I'm often more aware of kind of the disadvantages of Zoom. But I really had a different kind of level experience just, you know, in those moments. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
So I'm watching the time, and the one thing I do feel obligated to is to end pretty much as scheduled on the half hour. I have a few reflections, but I'd also like to make sure if there's someone who's really eager to say one more thing, we have time for that. So does anybody else want to add something?
May I?
No, go ahead.
Hi, Bella.
Hi. Good to see you again. So thank you for the breathing exercise, because I never really went through an exercise session, a short session like that focus on the pause between inhale and exhale, and that really made me feel that oneness with all, and that has been my purpose, really to co-create oneness with all, and I felt that.
Thank you.
Exercise that we did, and yet on another level in the breakout session we had. So I was asking people how it was, how the lockdown was with them, because we've been on quarantine for 6 months here in Manila, where I live, and but I see it as a good thing, because we were forced to do Zoom and use Zoom all the time, and never did I imagine I could easily connect with people all over the world. So thank God to the quarantine that we're able to connect to each other all over the world. You know, hundreds of people in all these Zoom meetings. So that's still about connection and oneness with all. So thank you for this experience.
Thank you.
I would just say that I'm noticing that we're not talking about our collective suffering, and that this time is a time of suffering and dismay. And it's curious that I haven't heard people talking about that. And I think that fact alone, that we haven't been talking about it, is really important. That there's a big difference between getting better and feeling better. I'm a psychotherapist by training, and helping people to endure their suffering keeps us from acting out.
Maybe I can elaborate on that. In our very difficult times, I remind a quote from Karl Weick, that when we deal with the inexplicable, or that when we try to make sense of overwhelming events, such like this pandemic and all the cascading political decisions that are sometimes poorly made, that we tend to go through different stages. We start with superficial simplicity, then we switch to the confused complexity, and eventually, hopefully, and this relates or connects with the exercise we did earlier, we maybe reach profound simplicity, and we manage to get still in the eye of the storm and try to make sense and connect with really what matters. This is my say.
I'd like to add a quick point reflecting on
using some systems awareness to reflect on the exercises of aspiration and purpose. And I think the junction between those teachings from the 90s, Peter, you were talking about, and the importance of work on purpose, but also questioning the alignment of our purpose with the critical factors that are the food systems, the energy systems, the state of the world as it is, and the alignment at a somatic embodied level, at our conceptual level, and at our collective level, as our alignments interact in a different way and as a larger one emerges. And I find that there is a lot of letting go in rebuilding a purpose and abandoning a purpose we might have espoused when we realize that it does not align with what the emerging whole requires.
Well, we have about 5 more minutes. If it's okay, I'll just offer a few kind of closing thoughts. And they're closing only in the sense that we have to close. So I don't mean these in any way as a kind of a summary, because I think the conversation is itself. I don't think it warrants a summary. And I so appreciate so many of the comments. I mean, it's very, very rich. The somatic practice we did at the beginning, I think, has kind of developed over a few stages. And I was thinking of a story I want to share. It's a short one. A woman who's started to help us in several of the networks is a woman named Melanie Goodchild. She's an Ojibwe teacher from Ontario, Canada area. She's quite unusual because she's a wisdom holder in her tradition. She's been given certain ceremonies that she is now expected and entitled to perform for others, but she's also completing her PhD in system science. So she's a boundary crosser. She's very unusual in the being deeply grounded in her native tradition and being really quite conversant and capable in our modern contemporary Western-based system. And she had a beautiful little story she told recently. So one of her basic ceremonies is a type of smudging ceremony. She has an eagle feather that she's called in their tradition their bundle. She travels with her little bundle. So her bundle includes an eagle feather, and many of you have done smudging as a very traditional Native American ceremony where you have some smoke, usually arises from burning sage or cedar in perhaps a little shell. I think in her case it's a seashell, and people take the smoke and use it as a cleansing agent. That's called smudging. And then while they're doing that, she'll wave her feather and go around person to person, and it's a chance for each person to give some prayer and some real sense of connection to the smoke and the space, the invisible space connected. But her story was pretty funny. She said, originally I was very reticent to do this remotely, to do this on a Zoom call. You know, I've been trained how to do it with people all together. She said, but as I've been doing it more and more, many people are telling me they smell the smoke. And she used that reflection as a doorway into something which I think is quite fundamental, and one that probably is in the background of many of our reflections, but it may be good to bring it in the foreground. And what I'm referring to is the profoundly materialistic character of contemporary society. I'm trained as an engineer and scientist, but saying as an engineer and scientist, you know, in many ways, Western science is built up, certainly in its first few centuries of formation, which in turn became critical to the technology and the characteristics of modern society around a materialistic perspective. You all kind of remember Descartes' famous letter to the Pope, in which he said, you know, our world is re extensa, the Latin term for extended world, material world. Your world is re intensa, the spiritual world. We won't bother you if you don't bother us. Because he didn't want to have happen to him what had happened to Galileo. So that created in some way the space for Western science to develop as initially a profoundly materialistic perspective, but then it layered into other things in the culture. But anyhow, that fundamental kind of reflection how deeply materialistic our contemporary culture is. And I'll go back to my comments about habit. So please don't take this as a statement about reality. It's really meant to be a statement about habit. Our habitual ways of thinking and acting have been shaped by this materialism. Yet, at another level, it's not who we are. And we kind of can pierce through that. Acknowledging suffering is a very important part of that. So I really appreciated that comment. It's very important to remind ourselves, whatever our feeling is right now, it is only a little part of the larger reality. But that acknowledgement of suffering does not have to be a materialistic one. In some sense, modern society has created suffering for all of us. By separating us from our broader, deeper, and inherently spiritual nature, we create the conditions for suffering for all. I just thought that was such a beautiful way to kind of end this. I remember years ago, I had a very interesting one of those moments. You know, I've gone to a place in central Colorado there's a traditional spiritual ground, and I'd been directed to go there, and I went there, and and it was perfect day, and you could almost touch the clouds. It was way high up in the mountains, but in a meadow. It was very weird. And I just had this very direct kind of communication of what I should be paying attention to. But what was really interesting about it was that it was one of those moments when you're in time and not in time. You're in the material world and you're not in the material world. It was a reminder that that's our nature. And in that moment, I look back at my life. I was about 47, 48 years old at that time, and everything made sense. It was like everything that had happened so the next thing could happen. And that made sense so the next thing could happen, none of which was apparent in the moment. So that possibility that there is a deeper kind of purpose shaping us. Yes, we have our personal purpose, but there's a deeper kind of purpose shaping us is exactly what Melanie is pointing to. That is, in some sense, almost a defining feature of a more broader spiritual-based awareness. And we can't see it. I was reminded of this by a very simple fact. Imagine this pandemic had happened 10 years ago. I have to say, I'm not a technology or a person who worships technology, but I'm so appreciative of the way Zoom works. I mean, here we are, 60 of us all around the world and others watching on YouTube, literally connected. This would not have been possible in the same way 10 years ago. It's not an accident. Consider the possibility that it's not an accident, that this happens now when we have recourse to meeting as we've met today, to listening to each other, just speak simply and directly. Thank you. And thanks, Stephen, for organizing all this, and the Global SoL gang. Really appreciate your efforts.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. We all wouldn't be here probably if it wasn't for what you started back in the mid-90s. So we are deeply grateful that you are still our inspirational council member, and you will continue to hopefully drop in periodically and let us share in your wisdom and your perspective on things. Any last words before we say goodbye, Peter?
No, we're 3 minutes over.
Okay.
I apologize.
No, you don't need to apologize. Thank you all very much. Be looking forward to our next conversation next month. Stay well, stay happy, stay healthy, everybody.